I never thought I would have to fight to save a pond that had been part of my family for over 50 years. But one afternoon, I came home and found my grandfather's legacy slowly disappearing. And the man responsible was standing there telling me it was just water. The thing he didn't understand was that it was never just water to me. It was memories. It was family. It was the one place on my property that still felt untouched by the outside world. My name is Daniel Harper. And for most of my life, I lived on a quiet piece of land tucked away in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside a small mountain town where everybody knew everybody and people still waved when they passed each other on the road. My property was only 3 acres. Nothing huge, nothing flashy, but it was mine, and it had something most people would spend their whole lives trying to find: peace. The center of that peace was a small spring-fed pond my grandfather built back in 1975. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't some famous builder. He was just a hardworking guy who loved being outdoors. He spent weekends carrying river rocks by hand, shaping the shoreline, building a little wooden dock, and creating a place where our family could slow down for a while. When I was a kid, that pond was where my grandfather taught me how to fish, where my dad and I sat quietly after long days, and where I eventually took my own kids when they were old enough to appreciate what it meant to have a place that belonged to your family. After my grandfather passed, I inherited the property, and one of the first things I did was rebuild that old dock. I replaced the damaged boards, cleared the weeds, and made sure the pond stayed healthy. Every few years I had it professionally maintained, not because I had to, but because some things are worth taking care of, even when nobody else understands why. The county had it listed as a private water retention feature, not a commercial lake, not some development opportunity, just a natural part of my land that supported my garden, local wildlife, and the little ecosystem that had existed there for decades. Then everything changed when a man named Ethan Caldwell bought the property next to mine. Ethan was a developer, the kind of guy who always looked like he had just stepped out of a business magazine. Brand new truck, expensive boots that somehow never got dirty, sunglasses even when the clouds covered the sun. The first time we met, he walked over to my fence line with a big smile and shook my hand like we were already business partners. He told me he was planning to build several luxury nature cabins on his land, something he called a mountain retreat experience. I remember looking over at my old wooden fence and thinking how strange it was that my quiet little corner of the world had suddenly become valuable to people who had never cared about it before. Ethan seemed friendly enough, and I wanted to believe he was just another neighbor trying to improve his property. During our conversation, I mentioned that the pond was fed by a natural spring that ran through the hillside. I told him the water system was delicate and had been there for generations. He nodded, but he wasn't really listening. I noticed his eyes weren't on me anymore. They were looking past me, studying the slope of the land, the direction of the water, the way the hill dropped toward his construction area. At the time, I brushed it off. Maybe I was being suspicious. Maybe I was judging someone too quickly. I wish that had been true. About 2 weeks later, I took a short trip to visit my sister. It was only a few days away. Nothing unusual. When I drove back home, I immediately knew something was wrong. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I felt it. The property was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels empty. I walked toward the pond and stopped. The water level had dropped several feet. The shoreline that had always been full was exposed, muddy, and damaged. The little dock my grandfather built was sitting awkwardly above the lowered waterline. Then I saw it, a massive trench cut through the ground on Ethan's side of the property, leading directly toward the spring channel that fed my pond. A piece of heavy equipment was still sitting nearby, covered in mud, like whoever operated it had left in a hurry. And then standing there, looking at his phone like this was just another normal day, was Ethan Caldwell. He looked up, saw me, smiled, and that was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Something had been taken from me, and the person who did it didn't even think he had done anything wrong. "Daniel," he said casually, like we were talking about the weather, "don't worry. I just opened a drainage path for the construction site. It's all part of managing runoff." I looked at the disappearing water behind him and asked the only question I could think of. "Did you divert my spring?" He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Then he said the sentence I still remember years later. "Come on, man. It's just water." And right there, standing beside the pond my grandfather built with his own hands, I realized Ethan didn't see what I saw. He saw a resource. He saw a problem to move around. He saw a shortcut. I saw 50 years of memories. And I knew if I didn't do something, that pond wouldn't just disappear. The entire story behind it would disappear with it. I wish I could say I exploded right there, that I yelled at Ethan and gave him the kind of speech people expect in a moment like that. But honestly, I didn't. Something about seeing that pond half empty, seeing the mud exposed where clean water had been for decades, made me quieter instead of louder. I had learned something from my grandfather that day when he showed me how to build that old dock. When something matters, you don't protect it by losing control. You protect it by being smarter than the person trying to take it away. So I took out my phone and started documenting everything. I photographed the trench, the direction of the water flow, the exposed pipes, the equipment tracks, even the machine hours displayed on the excavator. Ethan watched me and actually laughed a little. "You really think pictures are going to change anything?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "No, Ethan, I think facts are going to change everything." He rolled his eyes and walked away, probably thinking I was just an angry homeowner making noise. That was his first mistake. He assumed because I wasn't shouting that I wasn't serious. What he didn't know was that I had spent years maintaining that property, learning every detail about it, and I knew exactly who to call. The next morning, I contacted Dr. Melissa Grant, a hydrologist who had inspected the pond years earlier when I registered the water feature with the county. She wasn't the kind of person who got dramatic about things. Melissa was calm, professional, the kind of expert who could look at a muddy hillside and immediately understand what happened underneath the surface. When she arrived, she didn't say much at first. She walked the property slowly, following the altered water path, checking the soil, examining where Ethan had cut through the slope. After about 20 minutes, she stood near the trench, crossed her arms, and let out a quiet breath. "Daniel, this isn't a drainage adjustment," she said. "This is a diversion." I asked her what that meant. She looked back toward the emptying pond and said, "Someone redirected a protected water source without approval. This isn't just a disagreement between neighbors. This is the kind of thing the state takes seriously." Hearing that was strange because part of me felt relieved, but another part of me felt angry that it had reached that point at all. I kept thinking about how easy this could have been avoided. Ethan could have knocked on my door. He could have asked. He could have had a conversation like a neighbor. Instead, he brought in machinery, moved earth, and decided my property was simply something standing in the way of his plans. A few days later, I received an email from Ethan's attorney. The message was written in that polished legal language people use when they want to make something wrong sound reasonable. They called it a cooperative drainage arrangement. They suggested I sign an easement allowing continued water flow changes. Their offer was almost insulting, $200 and a promise that they would improve the surrounding landscaping. I stared at that number for a long time. $200. That was their value for something my family had protected for generations. I actually laughed when I read it, but it wasn't because it was funny. It was the kind of laugh you make when someone completely misunderstands the situation. They thought they were buying my cooperation. They thought every problem had a price. What they didn't realize was that the moment they sent that offer, they created the final piece of evidence I needed. I forwarded everything to the State Water Authority, including the photographs, the expert report, and Ethan's proposed agreement admitting he had altered the water flow. After that, things moved faster than anyone expected. Within a few weeks, Ethan received an official notice of violation. The state investigation found unauthorized water diversion, improper land alteration, and potential damage to a protected wetland area. Suddenly, the same man who had stood beside my property telling me it's just water was now sitting across from government officials explaining why he thought the rules didn't apply to him. I heard through the community that Ethan was furious. He blamed me for slowing down his construction project. He told people I was trying to stop development because I didn't like change. That part bothered me more than I expected, because it wasn't true. I wasn't against progress. I wasn't against his cabins. I wasn't some old man angry because someone built something new nearby. What bothered me was that Ethan believed progress meant everyone else had to sacrifice something so he could succeed. He wanted the benefits of the land without respecting the people who were already there. The hearing date eventually arrived, and I remember walking into that room feeling strangely calm. Ethan came in wearing the same confidence he always carried, but something was different. The smile wasn't there anymore. The expensive confidence had been replaced by nervous explanations and paperwork. His attorney argued that the project was designed to manage stormwater and support local tourism. They talked about jobs, investment, and economic growth. And those things sounded good until the state officials looked at the evidence. Because the truth was simple. You can't call something responsible development when you start by taking what doesn't belong to you. The board reviewed the photos, the expert testimony, and the records showing the pond's protected status. Then the chair looked directly at Ethan and delivered the decision that changed everything. He was ordered to restore the original spring channel, repair the damage, refill the pond, and pay the required penalties. There was no dramatic shouting, no movie-style argument, just a simple decision based on facts. And honestly, that made it even more satisfying, because for months Ethan believed confidence and money could carry him through anything. But standing in that room, he finally learned something my grandfather had understood his entire life. Land remembers, water remembers, and eventually, the truth finds its way back to the surface. The restoration day arrived almost 2 months after Ethan Caldwell first cut that trench through the hillside, and honestly, I expected to feel angry when I saw the crews arrive. I thought I would stand there looking at him and feel satisfied that he was finally being forced to fix what he broke. But when that morning came, when the sun was barely rising above the trees and a thin layer of fog was sitting over the property, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt tired. Not the kind of tired you feel after a long day of work, but the kind you feel after spending weeks fighting to protect something that should have never been threatened in the first place. I stood there with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the restoration crew unload their equipment, and I looked back at that old pond. For a moment, I could almost see my grandfather standing there again, wearing the same old work jacket he always wore, telling me that land is not something you simply own. It's something you take care of while you're here. The state inspectors arrived early, followed by a licensed restoration contractor who specialized in damaged waterways. They weren't there to punish Ethan anymore. That part was already decided. They were there to repair the damage and bring the land back as close as possible to the way it had been before someone decided they knew better than nature itself. The crew carefully removed the unauthorized drainage path Ethan had created. They rebuilt the slope, restored the natural flow of the spring, and filled the illegal trench with compacted soil under the inspector's supervision. Watching those machines move dirt back into the ground felt almost strange because just weeks earlier, those same kinds of machines had been used to take something away from me. This time, they were being used to restore it. Ethan showed up later that morning, standing near the edge of his property with his arms crossed. He looked different from the man who first walked up to my fence wearing sunglasses and talking about increasing property values. The confidence was still there, but it looked heavier now, like it had become something he had to carry instead of something that carried him. He watched quietly as workers repaired the damage. Finally, he walked over and said, "You know this set my project back months, right?" I looked at him and said, "Your project was never my problem, Ethan. The way you handled my property was." He didn't answer. He just looked away. And maybe that was the first time he actually understood the difference. This wasn't about stopping growth. It wasn't about being against business. It wasn't about an old homeowner refusing to accept change. It was about one person deciding that because he had money, plans, and influence, everyone else's rights became negotiable. Over the next few weeks, the pond slowly began returning to what it had always been. The water level climbed inch by inch. The exposed mud disappeared beneath the surface again. The damaged shoreline started healing. And then one morning, I walked outside and saw something that honestly almost brought me to tears. A blue heron standing at the edge of the pond. It had been years since I had seen one there. It was just standing quietly, like it had no idea there had ever been a fight over this place. Nature didn't care about lawsuits, arguments, or egos. It just waited for people to stop getting in the way. The frogs came back soon after. Then the deer started appearing again near the tree line. The garden recovered because I could finally use the pond water for irrigation again. Little things that most people would probably ignore started feeling like victories. A bird landing near the dock, the sound of water moving through the spring, the reflection of the trees on the surface in the evening. Those things reminded me why I fought in the first place. Not because I wanted to beat Ethan. Not because I wanted some kind of revenge story. I fought because once you allow someone to take something small simply because they think it doesn't matter, eventually they start deciding what else doesn't matter. Ethan did file an appeal after the restoration order, claiming the state had overstepped and that the restrictions were unfair to development. His argument was that he was trying to improve the area and create something valuable for the community, and I understand why some people might have found that argument appealing. Growth matters. Jobs matter. New businesses matter. But there is a line between building something and destroying something to get there. The appeal hearing lasted less than anyone expected. The board reviewed the original evidence, the expert reports, the photographs, and the restoration findings. In the end, they upheld the decision. The message was simple. Development does not give someone permission to ignore the rules that protect everyone else. After that, things became quieter. Ethan eventually completed a smaller version of his cabin project, but it was never the same ambitious development he originally imagined. Some people in town said I was too stubborn. Others said I did the right thing. I heard both sides. And honestly, I think that's what made the whole situation complicated. Property disputes are rarely just black and white. There are always different perspectives, different goals, different ideas about what progress should look like. But one thing I never changed my mind about was this. Nobody gets to decide that your memories, your hard work, or your property are less valuable simply because they stand in the way of their plans. Today, I still walk down to that pond almost every evening. I sit on the old dock, the same dock I rebuilt after inheriting the property, and I watch the sunlight hit the water. Sometimes I think about how close I came to losing it. Not just losing the pond itself, but losing a piece of my family's story. And I think about how easily the whole thing could have gone differently. One conversation could have prevented everything. One phone call. One moment where Ethan chose respect over convenience. But he didn't. He chose the shortcut. And sometimes shortcuts lead people exactly where they don't want to go. Looking back, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about water rights or regulations or dealing with difficult neighbors. It was about patience. It was about knowing when to speak, when to document, and when to let the facts do the fighting for you. Because the loudest person isn't always the strongest person. Sometimes the person standing quietly with the evidence is the one who has already won. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, standing there and watching someone drain a piece of your family's history without permission, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have tried to negotiate first? Or would you have gone straight to the authorities once you saw what happened? Do you think Ethan was just a developer trying to move forward? Or do you think he crossed a line when he decided the rules didn't apply to him? I would really like to hear your opinion, because these situations are never just about a pond, a fence, or a piece of land. They're about respect, responsibility, and whether we believe people should be allowed to take shortcuts when those shortcuts hurt someone else. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe because there are more real-life battles coming where ordinary people stood their ground and proved that sometimes the quietest person in the fight is the one who has been preparing the longest.